number 5 in our series on the book of Malachi. If everything goes well, okay, the very first part of the lesson this morning is going to deal with the second accusation against Israel in regard to marriage in the book of Malachi. And let me once again say, if everything goes well, somewhere along the middle of the class, we're going to segue into another controversy, which will then begin to sort of kind of introduce us to the prophetic element of the book of Malachi. Because beginning with Malachi chapter 2:17, we find a shift in the overall focus of the book of Malachi. Up to this point of Malachi chapter 2 verse 17, the Lord is dealing with the, quote, everyday practical matters of worship in the temple, of their interpersonal relationships, their familial type of relationships, that is husband and wife relationship. Now he's going to digress in chapter 3 verse 8 and following to talk about tithing, but with that exception from chapter 2:17 and following until Malachi chapter 4, really the focus is on the prophetic element of how God is going to deal with Israel. So before we get there, let's refresh our memories. Now, in last week's lesson, we talked about God's accusation against Israel in how Judah had violated the covenant of Yahweh by marrying foreign wives. Now, he's going to couple that accusation with another accusation, and it's probably almost 100% certain that they are related, but the focus is slightly different. This is the second thing, Malachi 2:13. This is the second thing that you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with crying. So he does not regard the offering anymore. That is, Yahweh does not regard the offering anymore, nor receive it with goodwill from your hands. Yet you say, for what reason? In other words, Lord, why aren't you going to accept our sacrifices anymore? After all, we are still offering sacrifice. Well, remember what he said back in chapter 1. Yeah, you're still sacrificing, but you're offering the blind, the lame, the sick, the imperfect. And they go, well, yeah, but. Well, now the Lord is saying, I'm not even going to accept your sacrifices because of this second thing that you're doing. Well, the first thing is you're marrying the daughters of foreign gods. And they can't argue with that because it was just simply a fact of life in Israel at the time, in Judah at the time. And the Lord just now adds and compounds to it. Here's the second thing you do. You cause tears and mourning to cover the altar. Now, boy, this is a really graphic statement that, by the way, could not be literally true. Why could it not be literally true? Well, because the focus is on the women who are being put away. We'll have more to say here momentarily about the question of whether or not they're actually being divorced. I know that the King James, the New King James, and several translations say the Lord hates divorce, but there's something else at work here, as many scholars have noted down through the years. And it has to do with the word divorce, whether or not it's actual divorce or whether it's just putting away. Because there's a distinction. But anyway, the Lord says, here's what you're doing. You're putting away the wives of your youth. And in doing so, you're committing violence against them. Well, once again, it was not woodenly literalistic in that sense, but it was metaphorically true. But when I say that it could not be literally true, that they were covering the altar in tears, weeping and sorrow, why could that not be literally true? Do what? Exactly right. The women who are shedding the tears of sorrow for being put away, women are never even allowed access to the altar. So this is a highly metaphoric, very, very hyperbolic statement that gives you the image that after being put away unjustly and improperly and illegally, so to speak, the women are coming and running to the altar and shedding their tears there and pleading before the Lord, when in fact they're not even allowed to touch the altar. But because they are the women of Israel, and because they're crying and weeping before the Lord, look at the story of Hannah. Remember that story in the book of Judges? Hannah brings her offerings to the judges, to the priests, so that they can offer those sacrifices. And what do they do? Well, Eli sees her crying. She is weeping. Well, that's sort of the imagery that we get here, and that is they would witness the crying, the weeping. They would see what was going on in Israel with all these broken marriages, and as a result of that is transposed onto the altar as if these women were gathered at the base of the altar, and they were hugging the altar, and they were weeping, and they were crying. Well, notice again, we didn't read far enough here. Let's just go ahead back to verse 14. Yet you say, for what reason? Well, because the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth, with whom you have dealt treacherously. Yet she's your companion, your wife by covenant. Did he not make them one, having a remnant of the Spirit? And why one? He seeks godly offspring. Therefore take heed to your spirit, let none deal treacherously with the wife of his youth. For the Lord God of Israel says that he hates divorce, for it covers one's garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. Now, in Israel, how could God say at this time that they were dealing treacherously with the wife of their youth if in fact they were divorcing their wives legally? Deuteronomy chapter 24 says if a man is married to a wife and she does not find favor in his sight because he finds some uncleanness in him, then let her put her away by writing her a bill of divorcement. So there's two things involved. Number one, put her away. Number two, give her a bill of divorcement. Now, the historical scholars tell us that what was happening here was a simple putting away without giving a bill of divorcement. Now, if a woman in Israel in ancient times was simply put away illegally, unlawfully, and was not given a bill of divorce, where does that leave her? Do what? Absolutely 100% destitute and without protection. Notice he says you do violence. You're bringing violence into the picture. Because you see, in Israel, the man is most assuredly responsible for the safekeeping, and that is to say the safety of the wife. A woman without the family protection of the husband is at the mercy of the criminals, violent people. So the question here becomes, were these men simply putting these women away? Well, why would they just be putting them away? To marry the wife or the daughters of the foreign gods. Let me ask you a question. Was it wrong at this time in Israel? Well, was it wrong since the beginning of Israel for a man to have multiple wives? Nope. Polygamy was accepted. Please don't anybody ask me if I approve of polygamy. My wife is sitting right back there, okay? And by the way, I would not do that. But legally, for instance, if they went out to war, Deuteronomy specifically tells us that if a man saw there a woman among the captives that was attractive to him, he could marry her and she would be like a native-born woman. Nothing wrong with that. Okay? Now that was in the case of war. So there were provisions for multiple wives without sin. Why is this sin? Well, there has to be some kind of caveat, some kind of an exception to the fact that God said, if you find uncleanness in your wife, put her away, give her a bill of divorcement so that she can be married to another. But you see, if she's not given a bill of divorcement, legally what? She can't get married again. She is truly a pariah. She's an outcast. And who, by and large, although there were certainly exceptions to it, according to Proverbs 31, of women who were very, very diligent in business, very successful in business, we know that in New Testament times, that in both Roman and Greek culture, women could be very, very prominent, as a matter of fact, in business, in culture, even sort of kind of behind the scenes in politics. So there were certainly exceptions to that, but again, by and large, the rule was that a woman that had been put away without being divorced was literally going to go broke. I mean, she was broke. She had no means. She would be viewed as an outcast. If she was not given that divorcement, then especially would it be true. By the way, if she was divorced because he saw some uncleanness in her, she was considered a pariah, so the question would arise whether or not a, quote, righteous man would want to marry her, because after all, she's got the stigma of divorce on her. But secondly, if she's put away without a bill of divorce, no self-respecting man's going to touch her, because after all, she's still legally married. Look, I got to tell you, when you study history of how the Jews distorted marriage, perverted it, and abused it, it is absolutely... Now look, this is bad enough, right? Here are men that seem to have been putting away their first wives, or who knows how many, but putting away their wives without actually divorcing them to marry another woman. Now look, once again, let's be reminded, legally they could just go marry some other woman, add her to his harem, to use that term. That was perfectly legal. That's not what they were doing. And as a result of their abuse of the system, as it were, they were causing untold misery on the part of the women. This problem here, with the exception of the marrying of women of foreign gods, but the abuse of women in marriage, through marriage, in spite of marriage, however you like to term that, had reached an incredible, incredible depth of depravity in Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, in the first century, there were two competing schools of thought in regard to marriage. One was from a rabbi by the name of Shammai, S-H-A-M-M-A-I. The other was of the Rabbi Hillel. Now, Shammai would have been known as the modern equivalent of the Churches of Christ, traditional view. You can only get divorced for one reason, that is adultery. Hillel, who, by the way, was the most widely accepted and most influential, seemingly, was considered the radical liberal. And his philosophy so permeated society and even rabbinic circles that when we read of what was going on, I mean, really, it's just, I mean, we have modern equivalents to it. But to give you, for instance, from some of the ancient writings, Hillel actually said that if a wife displeases the husband in the matter of cooking a meal, he is authorized to divorce her. In other words, if the wife burns the toast, gone. Give her a bill of divorcement. That's justifiable. Hillel even went so far as to say himself, on one occasion, it is reported, that if a man finds another woman that finds more favor in his eyes than his wife, that constitutes that his wife finding no favor with him. And that's uncleanness, therefore, guess what? He can put her away. You can kind of see where Hillel was in his philosophy. He not only said it was permissible, Hillel said and taught that if a man desired another wife, he was actually bound by Torah to put away his previous wife. Now notice he didn't say he can do it. He just said he's bound by law to do it. And by the way, a lot of the rabbis carried through with Hillel's view. The story is told of one particular rabbi. Talk about convenient. He was a traveling itinerant rabbi. He would go, from city to city, teach in the synagogues, a very prominent rabbi. I've forgotten his name at the moment. But he would travel from city to city, teaching in the respective synagogues and what have you. And he never liked to be alone on the weekend, so to speak. So what did he do? He had a traveling companion, a man, and when he was getting ready to go into a city, his representative would go into the city, and there close to the synagogue, right there in a prominent place on the city square, he would post a sign that said, Rabbi such and such desires a wife for the following times. In other words, Rabbi such and such is coming to town, he needs a wife for the weekend. He would be there for the weekend. Oh, he would marry her, by the way. I mean, he would, whatever ceremony he wanted to use, and by the way, they had some really interesting things that we wouldn't recognize as a ceremony. I'm pretty sure two of them I'm pretty sure that he did not use two of them. The ancient Jews had one part of a wedding ceremony in which they would take the man and the wife, gather them in front of a rabbi, and they would literally take a yoke off of a set of oxen and put it on their necks. And they would strap it on them and say, this is how you are bound. Now, obviously, that wasn't Hillel's doing that. Or they would take a great big chain and they would wrap it around the neck of each one of them and say, this is the strength of the bond between you. So they had some interesting things that they did. Well, back to this particular individual, he would have that wife for that weekend. As he began to leave, he would say to her, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee. Go to the next town, marry the other woman for the weekend. Go to the next town, marry the other woman for the weekend. That's how Hillel's marriage policy was played out in the first century. Well, think of that. Think of the social implications, the social ramifications of that for the women of the day. And you might conjecture and say, oh my goodness gracious, that had to be an awfully loose woman in order to do something like that. Well, that might be justified in being said, but there was a lot of prestige, interestingly enough, associated with being the wife of this rabbi. Oh, such a rabbi, such and such. Oh yeah, I was married to him for 3 days. Yeah, there you go. So, you had your 2 minutes or 3 days of fame, right? And so it's little wonder that we find in the ministry of Jesus in which they came to Jesus and said, Master, Moses permits divorce. What do you say? And Jesus really honestly did not take sides like we think he did. He reiterated the law of Moses and said, you got to make up your mind about what is right here. He reaffirmed the sanctity of marriage in that respect. And to the degree that he reaffirmed the sanctity of marriage, a man shall leave his father and his mother, shall be joined to one woman, or to a woman, and the two of them shall become one flesh. By the way, which harkens back to Malachi. Did he not make them one flesh? See? So Jesus hearkens back to Malachi, reaffirms the sanctity of the marriage as a covenant between them and Yahweh. And so in that regard, he did comment on Hillel to a great extent, but he did not enter fully into that particular controversy. I would suggest to you, therefore, that when we come to verse 16, that while divorce is certainly included in it because of the concept of putting away, but I would suggest to you that God is more focused on the injustice of what was being done at the moment. Now, am I suggesting in any way, shape, form, or fashion that God was saying, hey, I don't care if you divorce, just don't put away? No, I'm not suggesting that. Because their divorce was based upon their own carnal desires, their own selfishness, their own materialism, to use the term, that caused them to put away one wife, no matter what the grief was, no matter what the injustice was. So yeah, God hated that. But lying at the root of this particular controversy was the fact that they were putting away their wives without giving them a bill of divorcement, thus allowing them to be married to someone else and being under the protection of that someone else, this other husband, etc., etc. And so there are many, many facets of what Malachi chapter 2 is discussing here, instead of simply saying, all right, and don't anybody misunderstand me to say that Malachi somehow, some way would justify flippantly divorcing. Because I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying that the focus is on the simple putting away without divorce. If we want to extrapolate